Jealous of her? Not even. Me? Jealous? No. Me? Jealous? A little bit, maybe, but I like what's the big deal about it all? Well, let's take a look at jealousy today. So, I'm in 1 Samuel chapter 18, beginning in verse 1. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return to his father's house. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Whatever Saul sent him to do, David did it successfully. That Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all the people and Saul's officers as well. When the men were returning home after David killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing. Wonderful songs with joyful songs and with tambourines and lutes. As they danced, they sang, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Saul was very angry. This refrain galled him. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands? What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. So from that day forward, there were many times that Saul tried to kill David. David, the man after God's own heart. Yes, David, the man after God's own heart. David, the one that helped Saul when nobody would face Goliath, when everybody was intimidated and frightfully reeling to death, and everybody was shaking their shield, and the little shepherd boy that came up, and he was going to take down Goliath, and he did take down Goliath? Yes, the one that helped Israel. The one that Saul was asking about in the end of chapter 17. He says, who is that young man? Who is he? I want to know who that young man is, because he defeated the biggest warrior, so he knows David can do some things. David can shake some things. And so he also asked David to come to his house. David calms him with the harp. He does everything for him. He wins battles in army. He excites Saul. He gives him success on the home front. And he also comes and soothes Saul and relaxes him with his melodic songs as he plays the harp. But so what's the deal now? Why is Saul turned on David? Well, he did appreciate him. And he did appreciate himself, obviously, because down here in verse 7, they said, Saul has slain his tens of thousands. You can imagine that in a big regal robe and an ostentatious crown. You can imagine him stopping his horse. And hey, calm down for a second. Just breathing in. I have slain my thousands. You hear those girls? They're dancing for me. You see those instruments? They're playing for me. I'm the king. They know I'm the king. Hey, I didn't even want to be the king. They chose me to be the king. No wonder. I mean, I guess they should go ahead and sing about me. Right after that, they said, and David his tens of thousands. Very angry, it galled him. It was a terrible thing for him. He didn't like that at all. Why? Because he wasn't in the spotlight anymore. When David was valuable to him, when David conquered Goliath and the army of Israel was highlighted, Saul looked good. He's the king. He's in charge of all this. When Saul went and slayed the thousands, he looked great in the eyes of the people. When they were singing about him, he felt amazing. But as soon as that refrain turned to someone else's name, he wasn't in that anymore. He became so jealous of them that for the rest of his life, he was attempting to murder David. If you look at the story, many times David calls out Saul. He's like, what are you doing? And Saul even cries. He says, David, you're more righteous than I. I'm sinning. What am I doing? Then soon later, this jealousy entangles Saul again, and he goes after David again and again. So jealousy, jealous thoughts. I like her shirt. Oh, I like his car. I could see myself getting behind one of those, getting behind the payments later on for sure. But you might say, oh, he's got a really cool ability. He can really speak well. She is really smart at that. And so it's a petty little fire, it seems like, but it's only a petty little fire if we squash those thoughts, if we get rid of jealousy. As you understand, we're people of God. We really should hate sin. We should hate all sin. If a little thought of jealousy, a little tinge of it, don't denounce it. Don't act like it's not there. Don't deny that it's there. Don't shove it off like it's a light thing. Oh, everybody. No, get rid of it. It's sin. Take that captive from God, because it may seem like a petty fire. But look at this story of Saul and David. It's one step away from murder. That sounds outrageous, Brett. What are you talking about? Well, think about it. You see somebody and they're doing pretty well. Or imagine back up. Imagine you're in the spotlight. Your teacher, whoever, was like, wow, Brett Gardner did such a good job today. And I'm like, yeah, I did such a good job, class. Look at me. I'm a really great guy. That's great. The kids that glaring at me and stuff. But I don't know what that feels like at that time. But then the next report card comes out and somebody else is the star of the show, blah, blah, blah. And no spotlight is left on me. Or perhaps they're the star of the show and you're now second or third place. And so you might be rivaling them. You're feeling inferior to them at that point. So these thoughts kind of fester and brood in you, and you want to let them go because what's next? Oh, you got your other friend in class or whatever. You can tell school's back in. Not really. So you got your other friend in class. Oh, I can't believe she only does that to get attention or whatever. So you start doing those little thoughts. So a thought of jealousy is a sin. Then it's spiraling into my gossip, which is also a sin. So it seems like murder's not here, but you might trip that person, embarrass them, do something to harm them in some way. It's on the way to murder. Why? Because Saul kept a jealous eye on David, and that only ensued in murder. And that might seem ridiculous, but look at Matthew 27:18. The high scribes, the religious leaders who saw the miracles of Jesus Christ, who heard the authority and power of Jesus Christ, they could not get over their envy of him. They handed him over out of envy. They hated Jesus Christ because they were envious of him. They were the men in charge. They were the religious leaders that everybody came to, sought advice, and they could tell them whatever they wanted, and those people believed it, and they loved that clout. I guess it's a good thing to have, but then they loved it so much that when Jesus Christ came and took the spotlight, they began to be envious of him. And that was a small thing really at the start. It was that little spark that turned into a fire. They saw Jesus Christ, they began to get envious, but that sore festered to them. It was unkempt and unchecked, and that sore just sat in them. And then one day they handed him over to Pilate out of envy. And if you read through these stories, it's awesome because Pilate is like, this is ridiculous. Herod is like, why did you send me this guy? And out of envy, they bogusly blustered through Pilate and Herod. They handed him over out of envy. They said, why did you do this? Why did you? They said, would we have handed him over to you if he wasn't such a bad man? Oh, yeah, we need to kill him. And then they're like, oh, what in the world? And even Pilate tries. He says, hey, you guys, look, that man's innocent. It's obvious he's innocent. If you are really so bent on something, I mean, I will strip him bare. I will put a bunch of thorns and pieces of glass on a flog, and I will flog him and rip his skin off, and you guys can watch him bleed, laugh, get your thrill out of that, They said, no, crucify that man. We have no king but Caesar. Put his blood on our children. Don't you get it, Governor? We're not going anywhere till that man is dead. If you don't do this, we're going to call Caesar ourselves and tell him you're ridiculous, and we'll get you out of here too, Pilate. Get that man out of here. We hate him. Put his blood on our children. Out of envy. This all came from envy. Those people actually really didn't know what they were really saying because the religious leaders roused them up. They said, he's bad, he's bad, he's bad. And like we talked about earlier, they had so much clout that people just believed him. They said, oh yeah, these are the religious leaders. So they handed him over. And as that man, Jesus Christ, is dying right there on the cross, these people that have seen his miracles, these people that really know veritably he's the Son of God by what he has accomplished, by what he has shown through prophetic word and what he has fulfilled. And they see him up there, and they see him writhing in pain. They see his anguish. They see the blood trickling down in rivulets on his face from that crown of thorns. And they pity him. No, they don't pity him. They still hate him to death. How do you know they hate him? Because they point at that man that's dying for you and I, the Savior we love, Jesus Christ, and they say, oh, you're the guy? You're the Christ? Wow, well, come down. Come. I mean, you're the miracle worker. Come down and show us that. And why am I going on so much? Because all of that spiraled out of envy. All of that, it just ensued envy. And in Matthew 5:21 through 23, God says, hey, you need to check yourself with anger. You guys have heard that it was a sin to murder, and you heard that you'd face judgment from God. But have you known that if you are angry with somebody, you will also perhaps stand in judgment? And so we have to think about envy. We have to think about anger. We have to think about these things that perhaps we don't think of big. They are big. Envy's big. Gossip's big. These don't go anywhere good. These things go to make you more like the devil. What does it mean that the devil entered Judas? When did that happen? When was it not so much his desire as the devil entered him? What is James talking about in James chapter 1 around verse 12 or something? And he says, we're not duped by God. God doesn't tempt us. You sin when you have an enticement in your heart, such as jealousy or envy. And he says, you sin because you let that thing go unchecked. You let it settle in there, and you don't discard it and give it to God. You kind of think about it. Maybe you don't think about it, but as long as it sits in there, James says, you better watch out, because that thing is growing and palpitating inside of you to a menace. It's going to fully grow, and it's going to be sin. And what is the consequence of sin? Death. What is the consequence of sin? Death and eternal punishment in hell, separated from your Lord with your back to him. So let me just ask you, as I ask myself, is that worth being jealous over somebody? Is that worth, oh, she did this, he did that? Let's take these thoughts captive out of reverence for Jesus Christ, please.